One of the most often repeated statements at the end of this past year and the beginning of this new year is that 2020 was a bad year. It's said so often. I was thinking, you can't start the first Sunday of 2020 by saying 2021 by saying 2020 is a bad year. Like, how many times you have to state the obvious, right? So I thought, yeah, you just got to kind of move on and not. But it's also what we call in English the elephant in the room. It's the thing that is there that everyone's aware of, and we just want to be done with it, but we can't entirely be separated from it. It was certainly a bad year. But as I was thinking about it, for some of you, it may not be the worst year that you've had. Some of you, for instance, have experience of being in Lebanon during the war, and when there was fighting, and there was danger each and every day. Fortunately, we didn't have that this past year. So when we think about it being a bad year, ironically or surprisingly, that in some ways it could have been even worse. It was certainly unusual, regardless if it's true that it's been your worst year or not. It was definitely unusual. We started with protests against the government in the beginning of the year. Then we had the corona virus after that. We've had, connected to all of this, economic collapse. The country is falling apart economically. We've lost the value of our money, for instance. We've had explosions, or one major explosion, and then even after that, fires that popped up here and there, which has created several types of destruction throughout the city. When I say maybe some of you had a worse year, you might be thinking, how is that possible? After I've just relayed all of that information, reminded you of all these bad things that have happened. That's why during our prayer time I wanted us to think of something that we could thank God for, because our year has not been conducive, I think, for many of us to thanking God because of these problems. And we stand now here at the beginning of 2021, looking back on 2020, and we're glad that it's behind us. We're glad we're looking at it in hindsight. Hindsight means looking at something after you've already passed through it, so looking back on it. I think we're all happy that it is behind us and we don't have to go through that again. We usually use the expression in English, hindsight is 20/20, to mean that looking in the past is clear vision. So we would distinguish 20/20 vision always has this slash between the two, right? So your vision is this over that. So 20/20 vision means perfect vision. I'm not sure, however, in thinking about 2020, if there was much clarity in the year at all for us. The year certainly is hindsight, but is it really 2020? Because I think for many of us, we still look back and say, why? How? How could these things happen? How could we have reached a point in which the economy is so bad that people have lost their pensions, people can barely survive any longer on the pay that they're getting? How could something like the explosion in the port occur? How does that happen? And there's still a lot of things that we don't know. And there's actually very little clarity. So maybe the only thing that applies is that hindsight is 20/20 in the first sense, in terms of the year. Because I'm not sure hindsight is 20/20 in our ability to understand exactly what has gone on. I pray that this coming year, regardless of what happens in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, that we will attain greater clarity. That we will have 20/20 vision, in a sense. Greater transparency about who we are, about what God is doing in our lives. I pray that the fogginess, the difficulty in seeing, the blindness in our understanding of the events of this past year will be lifted to reveal something of the work that God is doing in us, that we'll be able to see him in some way, in a way that we haven't seen him before. And that something will happen in my life, and will happen in your life, and will happen in our congregation, which causes us to see God more clearly. The predicament that we find ourselves here in this transition from 2020, this very difficult year, into a new year, in which always brings a sense of hope. However, even here in Lebanon, we struggle with that because we ask ourselves, when is it ever going to really change? But the place that we stand at right now reminds me of the story of Jesus healing the blind man in John chapter 9. A man who lived his life without any clarity. A man who lived his life in fogginess, who lived his life in blindness, and then found himself in a transition period, going from blindness to seeing physically. But there's also more to the story that I think relates to what we find ourselves going through today. It's a passage that can teach us much about seeing truth, about seeing God, and about going from blindness to 2020. It comes to us in John chapter 9. The passage says this: as he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. He saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. What do we find here? Well, I think when looking at this story, the first thing I want to point out is the circumstances that this man found himself in are actually quite similar, or the circumstances not only for this blind man, but for the whole story, are quite similar to what we find ourselves in today. It says in verse 1, as he passed by. An interesting way of beginning a new chapter. I haven't given you what happened, what he was passing by, right? It starts, the end of chapter 8 is the conclusion in part of a story, and then it continues in chapter 9. And in chapter 8, we have the account of Jesus talking with the religious leaders in a long discourse with them, in which he culminates this by saying, before Abraham was, I am. Which causes the religious leaders to rise up in opposition against him, in anger against him, and what I would say is animosity against him, and it says they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Verse 1, as he passed by, there was a man blind from birth. So this verse 59 that I have for you here is the last verse of chapter 8, and we read the first verse of chapter 9. It says, as he passed by, he saw this blind man who is there. So what is happening in the middle of this story? Jesus finds himself in the face of great animosity towards him. Opposition. Religious leaders who are against him. They try to stone him, and he escapes and goes out and sees this blind man. We began this past year, 2020, in an environment of intense animosity. People rose up in protest against the political leaders with great frustration and anger, animosity between the people and the leaders, which in fact led to animosity between the Lebanese themselves. And we saw that in demonstrations where groups of Lebanese fought against others and beat one another. And we had this tension and this anger welling up around us. The year ended with animosity. It ended with anger and revolt and protest. Just here at the university that I teach at, the American University of Beirut, just this past week, there were protests all around the university, on Bliss Street and down on the Corniche, in opposition to the university changing its exchange rate from the old exchange rate to the new exchange rate, the bank exchange rate, which then forces the Lebanese students to pay more for their education this coming semester. And what did this cause? It caused an outrage of animosity against the administration for doing this. We started with animosity and we ended with animosity. And in fact, you could probably show several examples along the way in which it continued. The explosion down at the port and the response to that, the anger that came from that against the government. What else do we find here? We also find poverty. We find a blind man who was where? Where was this blind man? He was at the temple. So he was at the place where the religiously devout would go and perform their religious duties. Why do you think he would go to the temple? Sorry? For offerings, for alms. He's asking, he's begging there. John chapter 5 tells us, John says in chapter 5 that there were several beggars, blind, lame, who used to go to the temple and stay around the temple looking for the alms, gifts that were given to them from the worshipers who would go to the temple. We would assume that we find this blind man in a similar predicament. What's ironic, though, is he goes to the temple, and we find out later in John chapter 9 that he was there on a day in which he couldn't benefit at all. He couldn't receive any alms because he was there on the Sabbath. And the giving of alms on the Sabbath was considered a work. It was something that the Jews were not allowed to do. But he was there anyways on the Sabbath. I think he was there anyways because he probably had nothing else to do. What's a blind man in first century Palestine to do? We have in the United States, for instance, you can call down to the local library and the library will send you audiobooks, for instance. Social services. In fact, you don't even need that anymore because you can get it all online, right? But there's social services. They didn't have these type of social services in the first century. What's a blind man to do in this predicament? Well, he went to the temple because there's no other place to go. He's dependent on the kindness of the religiously devout. And unless you're blind, like this blind man, what we have seen this whole year is poverty. Have you walked around the streets of Hamra, and have you noticed how many more beggars? At least it seems to me, the number of beggars on the streets, the number of poor seeking for alms from people, for gifts from people, seems to have increased. But it's not even those that are in the streets that are feeling this. It is people who are educated. It's people who used to have jobs who don't have jobs. It's people who currently have jobs and the income that they make cannot sustain them. And they've gone from being stable, self-sufficient, independent people to essentially living in poverty within the space of a few months. I know some people in these circumstances. I know one man and his wife that this man works probably 12 plus hours a day, and he can barely make enough money to feed his family, and he can barely make enough money to provide rent payments. In fact, if it wasn't for the graciousness of our congregation and the monies that you give, he and his family probably wouldn't be able to survive. and he works hard, and he's educated, but he's poor. What else do we find here? We find isolation. This man finds himself in isolation. A blind man is alone. He's there by himself. He was isolated. Not only that, he definitely lived in a world of his own much of the time with this type of disability. A disability of this type is challenging no matter what the circumstances are, but as I just noted, imagine that disability in first century Palestine. And all of us have found ourselves isolated many, many times this past year. As we've been told, you need to stay in your home. You can't go out. The only interaction we have is through a computer or through a phone. We're stuck in our homes. We're isolated. And this has created great anxiety for many of us. We've also found ourselves blind, like this man, knowing that there are problems around us, but not being able to find any clarity on exactly how to solve them. And so we're stuck at home, helpless, feeling hopeless. And as you think about those circumstances that you found yourself in this past year, you can identify with what this blind man is going through in the first century Palestine. Lastly, what do we find here? Ignorance. The disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? What does Jesus say? Neither one. You're wrong on both counts. They had a multiple choice test. They put down two options, and they ended up wrong on both. That's a pretty bad exam result, isn't it? Jesus said, you're wrong on this, and you're wrong on that. It was no fault of his nor of his parents. And Jesus is trying to force them, or is challenging them, to not look at the cause of his circumstance, but to pursue the cure for his circumstance. Not focus on the thing that got him there, but consider what can get him out of this. Their question is a question of ignorance. Their question shows that when they look at this man, all they saw was a predicament. All they saw was a theological problem. A theological problem that had roots in their own theological tradition, certainly, but Jesus was trying to show them that don't look at this man simply as a theological predicament. The impression we get here is if Jesus had told them, oh, it was his fault, then they would have said something like, well then we're not going to waste our time with him, and then just keep going on. We kind of have this sense when you read this text that they're really not interested in the human before them. They're interested in why he's here. Going back to our question about poverty, how many times do you hear people say this? Oh, if they would only work. Oh, if people weren't manipulating them. Oh, if they did this or if they did that. And we want to find a reason for why we can justify not reaching out and helping somebody else. Jesus is trying to get us to stop looking for the reason why they are there that might justify why we won't have to stop and help them, and look at how we can get them, how we can move from the cause to a change that brings about a cure. The question was ignorant. And we see a lot of ignorance around us. We see ignorance in the way we see other people around us. We see ignorance in terms of the virus that we're facing. There's a lot of ignorant statements that are bantered about on social media, for instance. We need to be careful about succumbing to ignorant talk. Don't partake in ignorant talk. If it's unclear, be wise. If there's no clarity, if it's not 2020, you don't know this or that, be wise, keep quiet, confess the complexity of the circumstances. Not everything that comes into your mind is profitable. Not everything that you have floating around here is something that needs to be expressed. Be wise. Jesus is challenging us to focus not on the source of our many problems, but to understand how we might be able to move beyond them. The story here is a story of a man found in a very difficult predicament. It's a story of animosity. It's a story of poverty. It's a story of isolation. And it's a story of ignorance. But most importantly, it's a story of how Jesus helps him overcome all those and provides clarity to him. The primary objective of the story seems to be that he was given his sight, correct? That here's a blind man who now has sight. But there's much more going on in the story than that. For instance, when we think about animosity, I don't want you to think about simply here, and I've done this intentionally, note 2020 is what this was. But when we come to understanding what Jesus does and what God is doing in our lives, it gives us clarity in each one of these issues. It gives us 2020 vision. It gives us clarity. And in terms of the animosity that Jesus is facing, it's interesting to note that in John chapter 9, the rest of the chapter, we find the interactions between this blind man and the same religious scholars who were trying to stone Jesus. Because when this man, when he's healed of his blindness, they find out about it. The religious leaders find out about it. And do you know what they do? They call him in and they begin to question him on how he got to this position. Who healed you? How did you were blind and now you can see. Explain to us how you got there. And their animosity that was directed towards Jesus in some ways becomes directed towards this poor blind man. Imagine that. You finally, after a lifetime of being blind, you finally can see, and the men of religion around you are only concerned in how you got there, and they begin grilling you over this process. What happens? They bring him in and they ask him how he got here. He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." So the first thing is, tell us what happened. He tells them exactly what happened. You know that guy named Jesus? He doesn't give us any theological statement about Jesus, does he? He simply says, the guy Jesus that we hear about. Jesus from Nazareth. He came, he told me to do this, I did it, and now I can see. Where is he? I don't know. Go find him yourself. They're not satisfied. Poor guy, they keep him. And they continue to talk to him. You can read the whole account when you get home, but I want to skip to verse 17. So then they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" And he said, "He's a prophet." Note the progression. He just says, here's Jesus, and now he said, "So what do you say about him?" And any religious person of the day would probably say, well, anyone who does something like this has to be a man of God, so he's a prophet. But guess what? That's not sufficient enough for them. They keep pressing him, and they keep challenging him. So then in verse 24, it says, "For the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, 'Give glory to God. We know that this man,'" meaning Jesus, "'is a sinner.'" You say he's a prophet. We know he's a sinner. Why? Because he does things like heal on the Sabbath day. He breaks the law. We already discussed at length the law and the relationship between Jesus and the law, so we won't return there. He's a lawbreaker because he doesn't keep these type of rules. The man says, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. Don't talk to me about these theological issues. If he's a sinner or not, I don't know. I know one thing. I was blind, now I see. That's my testimony, he says. I was blind, now I'm seeing. You guys want to talk about him being a sinner? That's up to you. Has nothing to do with me, is essentially what he's telling them. But guess what? When you find someone who's angry and engaged in animosity and trying to create problems, they don't give up easily, do they? Have you been around those type of people? They just seem like they always want to fight. They always want to find out and dig a little bit deeper and make it a little bit more complicated for you. And it continues, poor guy. They continue to ask him in verse 30. It says, the man answered, why? This is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. So you guys don't know about him, and yet he has come, he's opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Look at the blind man in isolation, in poverty, all of a sudden begins to convey spiritual truth. He says, you guys keep pressing me about this. I don't know. All I know is that someone can't do this unless they're a worshiper of God. You say he's a sinner? I'm not sure. God doesn't listen to sinners, does he? And this guy just healed me of my blindness. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So now we have this guy challenging them. Verse 34, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us? Why would they say that? Because they, like the disciples, believed that his blindness was a product of his sin. Either his own sin or his parents' sin. That he was born into that situation because he was a sinner. Blindness was a defect. That was the obvious manifestation of one's spiritual condition. So the religious leaders approach him the exact same way the disciples did. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The religious leaders say, who are you to tell us truth? You were born in sin. How do they know he was born in sin? Because he was born blind. Why would they argue that he's born in sin? Because he's born blind. And so what do? They cast him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? I like this blind guy. I should say I like this formerly blind guy. He seems like just a common, wise, straightforward, I'm just going to tell you like I know. I don't know who he is. I don't know who the Son of Man is. Tell me who he is so I can believe in him. He's not trying to play around at all. Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. The result of the healing, the physical healing, was that he had his physical blindness restored. But there's much more that goes on in the story. When you read the rest of the story, you find out the story is not about a guy who is blind who now has sight. The story is about a guy who is blind who comes to realize that Jesus is Lord and makes a declaration of faith in him. Lord, I believe. That's the story. It's not simply that he has physical 20/20 vision, but now he has spiritual 20/20 vision. Now he begins to see God and understand who he is. And he said, show me this guy, the Son of Man, that I would believe in him. And Jesus says, here I am. And he says, Lord, I believe. That's what he's trying to get at. In the events of all of this, the objective was to get him to that point. In the events of your life, both the tragedies, the blindness, and the blessings, the healings, if these things do not cause you to consider your spiritual condition, then you're missing the most important lessons that God's trying to teach you. If it simply is, I didn't have this, now I do, then you've missed the boat. That's the story here. It's not the man was blind and now he can see. The story is that here's a man who is spiritually blind who can now see, while the religious leaders who claim to be able to see are blind. That's what Jesus is trying to get at here. And in their discussion, in their animosity against the blind man and against Jesus, they don't see their own blindness. And it's a warning to us that if we build up animosity in our hearts against the Lord for what we think he's not done for us, then we are failing to understand the objective of his work in our lives, which is to cause us to understand him and see him more clearly. Something else that inspires me about this blind man, that he kept doing what he always did. He went to the temple. You think about poverty, he couldn't get anything there, as we mentioned before. He was on a Sabbath day. Who was going to help him? They'd have to be a rule breaker to help him. Fortunately, on that one Sabbath, he found a rule breaker. That one Sabbath, a rule breaker just happened to come by and heal him of his blindness. But what did he do? He went there regularly. And as I mentioned last week, there comes a point in our lives in which we must decide that we're going to obey God no matter what. And just do something because it's right. Not because there's any immediate benefit for me, not because I have a material benefit, not because there's a physical benefit, but because it is right. Simply, purely. There seems to be no benefit for this man to go to the temple at this time. But he goes there, around the people of God. And I think that when we establish that, we put ourselves in the environment in which we can be blessed. What if he decided, I'm not going today? He would have missed a rule breaker that changed his life. What if you decide one day, I'm just not going to do what is right today because I'm tired of it? What benefit has it ever brought me? So, I look at this person over here, breaks the rules all the time. Doesn't seem like anything is happening to them. Looks like they're actually doing quite well. Looks like they're happy. So, I'm just going to do whatever I want to also. That's wrong. Don't go there. The blind man is poor, and he continues to go in order to put himself in the right circumstances to be blessed. When you're in a problem, the first thing you need to do is not make it worse. Keep doing what is right. When you find yourself in a predicament, even if it's a pit that you have dug yourself, at some point decide you're going to stop digging and do what is right. Because you can keep digging and make your situation even worse. We have this saying in English, or this image in English, about when you find yourself in a pit, you've dug yourself a pit, first thing to do is to stop digging. Because all you do, if you continue to do the things that you've done, listen to the bad advice, do the wrong thing, where that leads you? A deeper pit. It provides no help to you at all. So what I like about this blind man is in his poverty, he still does what is right. And I want to challenge you, don't make it worse. We're all in tough situations now. Make decisions that will help you get out of your problems. Don't make destructive decisions. Stop listening to bad advice. Stop digging. Here is a guy who used to hang out by the temple, and people would walk by him and not pay attention to him. He was isolated. All of a sudden, this guy's isolation is gone. In some ways, for him, not in a very good sense, because now he's the center of attention of all the religious elite. He went from a normal day, nobody cares about me, I'm going to go and sit there and hopefully some people will do something for me, or I'll just sit and wait because what else do I have going on? It goes from a normal day to all of a sudden he's put in front of all these religious leaders and he's in this theological discussion. No longer is he isolated. A completely different perspective on his life. He goes from a reject to the center of attention. He went from blind to 20/20 vision. And in the process of coming out of this isolation, he meets these religious leaders and in fact teaches them truth about who God is and eventually leads himself to the family of God by confessing to Jesus Christ, Lord, I believe. And he goes from one who's by himself to one who's in the circles of the family of God as a child of God through Jesus Christ. What a transition. What a day. Now he has a community around him of people who love God, who love Jesus, who want to serve him, who have the heart of Christ reaching out to him. He's no longer in isolation. He has his eyes that he can see physically, and he has people around him who are supporting him and are with him. His isolation is gone. Lastly, when you think about ignorance, the objective here is not only the progress that this blind man makes to faith, but it's also the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach the disciples, as I mentioned earlier. Prompting them to overcome their ignorance and looking at this man as a theological problem and not in his humanity. This is the objective that Jesus had for his disciples, that they would not be ignorant. They would not be ignorant of what God is trying to do in their life and how God is trying to use them to influence people around them for his kingdom. Don't be ignorant this year. Don't be ignorant this year. Do you know God is doing something in your life? He's working his plan in your life so that you could reach other people and draw them into the kingdom. Draw them to Jesus. Don't be ignorant about the circumstances around you. Even when you may not be able to see them clearly, what God wants to teach you is you can have clarity. You can have 20/20 vision. You can see in the circumstance an opportunity to reach out to somebody else. You can see in the circumstance an opportunity to be a witness, a testimony. One of the greatest forms of ignorance that we can reveal in our lives is a lack of awareness of the hand of God trying to draw us into a deeper connection with him. And if we don't see that, we are truly blind. If you can't see the hand of God in your life, then you are truly blind. And if all you can see is the circumstances around you, then you've missed what God is trying to do in your life. Jesus said it this way in Mark chapter 8, verse 36. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? Wrong perspective. Ignorance. The inability to see what is actually going on, what is really important. One of the greatest blessings I think that I could ask for my life, that I could ask for you, that I could ask for our congregation, for the people that I love, is that we would all have greater clarity about our lives. The most important aspect of this clarity is not having all the answers. When I say have clarity and 20/20 vision, it doesn't mean we have all the answers, because there's still things I don't understand. Clarity means understanding why I am where I am. Even if I know I'm standing in a difficult circumstance, I know why I'm here. I have clarity and I have peace. Clarity is understanding how I can use my situation to promote God's salvation, to promote spiritual healing. It's reaching the point where we trust the Lord enough to find peace in those things that we don't know, so that we can serve him in a way that conveys our trust in him to others. I don't understand this, but I'm going to show in my own life and to the world around me that God is still trustworthy. And God is still working something in my life to make me more like him. That we know that God cares for us. That we know that he has a magnificent purpose for us. If we would only give ourselves to him and listen to him. In fact, indeed, clarity, according to this passage, is the ability to say with a blind man, I don't have all the answers. All I know is this. I once was blind, and now I can see. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We ask that you would help us to see your hand in our lives. And while we may not have all the answers, that we could see that we were once this and now we're that we were once selfish and in isolation and maybe even antagonistic against you, poor, Not just poor in material ways, but poor spiritually, in that we're not concerned about you, ignorant about your work in our lives. Lord, I pray that at some point in this year, that the hindsight will be 2020, not simply leaving the bad 2020 behind us, but looking back and saying, now I see what you have done and why you've done it so that I can become more like Christ. So Lord, I pray that you will move us from this blindness to sight, a sight that understands your hand working in our lives. And that we all, by the end of 2021, if not sooner, would, with the blind man, say, Lord, I believe. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen.